Good morning, evening, or afternoon, or whenever you might be watching this. My name is Professor Ferraro, and welcome back to U.S. History 1877 to the present. I apologize if my audio today is a little bit more garbage than it usually is, but I have to get this recording done. About to be out of town. So let's go ahead and jump into it today. Last lecture, we talked about American imperialism with William McKinley. William McKinley is going to be assassinated towards the end of his presidency, and this is going to lead us into the progressive era with Teddy Roosevelt. So, we're going to go ahead today and talk about progressive era policies. So the progressive era is going to be from basically 1901 to 1920. It's going to span three presidencies. They're going to be known as the progressive presidents, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So, first up on the chopping block is Teddy Roosevelt himself. He had been William McKinley's VP, winning fame in the Spanish American War. Ultimately, Roosevelt is going to be the first of our progressive presidents. Ultimately, he's going to take a very hands on approach to Latin American politics. He's going to push forward economic reforms because if you remember from our previous lectures, we were talking about the Gilded Age, the corruption present there. Ultimately, Teddy is personally one of my favorite presidents, maybe not in terms of policy, but just as a person. Very fascinating character. Very manly man. He suffered from asthma as a kid, and he literally worked out so much that it went away. I know that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I know that's not how it scientifically works, but that is a fun story about Teddy Roosevelt. He was known for really hunting big game. He would go to Africa and go on safari hunts. One time when he's running for president, he's actually going to get shot. And after he gets shot, he goes ahead and he makes fun of the man who shot him. He goes ahead and gives the whole speech. And after the speech is over, he says, "It appears I've been shot." He walks off the stage. Now, you might be thinking maybe he just got grazed or something like that. He got hit center mass in the chest. The only thing that had stopped it is he had some items in his pocket to help slow down the bullet to where it didn't penetrate all the way through. He's also going to be the first ever president to invite civil rights advocates to the White House. Ultimately, Teddy Roosevelt's really going to set up the progressive era and a lot of the policies that are present throughout it. So, that is good old Teddy Roosevelt. So, the makeup of the progressive era. Between 1901 and 1914, you are going to see a ton of immigrants come through Ellis Island. Ellis Island itself is located in the New York Harbor, and these migrants are predominantly going to be from Southern and Eastern Europe. I like to jokingly call them the off-whites because they are going to experience a lot of racial discrimination, even though they are white by today's standards. Out on the East Coast, you have the equivalent with Angel Island. The way I always like to remember it is Ellis starts with an E, Europeans come through Ellis, Angel starts with an A, Asians come through Angel Island, California. Angel Island is much smaller than Ellis Island. You do not have that many Asians migrating to the US in the early 1900s compared to Europeans. Down in my home state of Texas, you're also going to see Mexican migrants enter in through El Paso, which tends to be a major place of migration even to this day. Now, these immigrant communities, they're going to move into major cities predominantly. They tend to form very close-knit communities. You'll see that in major metropolitan areas today, right? You'll have a Little Italy, or you'll have a Chinatown, or you'll have a neighbor where that is predominantly made up of Nigerians. They tend to move in and form community groups with people who come from the same walks of lives as they do. With all of that being said, though, there is a overall push for for these immigrants to Americanize, to assimilate to some degree or another. The rise of the Populist Party is going to greatly affect the politics of the progressive era. If you remember back when we talked about populism, I had mentioned that the legacy of the populists is really kicking off the progressive era. Their politics had caught on with the American public, and the Republicans and the Democrats are going to adopt many of their policies. You're also going to see the rise of consumerism, which is something we're going to be talking about for the next several lectures. You see the rise of massive department stores, of leisure activities such as movies and amusement parks. Ultimately, consumerism is going to arise when companies start making goods that the average person can buy, whether that be handbags or appliances or other things like that. It differs from industrial era from Gilded Age manufacturing, because Gilded Age manufacturing, they're making mostly industrial goods. I am never going to have any need for 2 tons of steel. That being said, I do have a need for a washer or for a dryer or for an electric iron. You start seeing more women in the workplace during this time period as well. And overall, the progressive era is really just characterized by improved standards of living across the board. It is a time of a lot of economic improvement, to say the least. So, with all of that being said, give me just one moment. So, here we see some of the new immigrants moving into the United States. You can see a wide variety of immigrants migrating to the United States. This is going to include uh, Mexicans, going to include Italians. Those are going to be my ancestors. It's going to include all types of Southern and Eastern Europeans, Gypsies, also known as the Romani people, people from Macedonia, even Russians and Turks, Hebrews. So you have all of these different people moving into the country. And here you can see this is from Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner. You can just see by 1920, this is the percentage of each city's population where their children are either first generation or they moved here to the United States. And you can see New York City. 76% of the people living in New York City, their parents are from another country or they themselves are from another country. This is going to lead us to Henry Ford and the assembly line. Henry Ford, in many ways, is a pioneer in American manufacturing. He's going to differ from the industrialists who come before him. He's going to offer good, positive wages to his employees. And it kind of makes sense with what he's manufacturing. He's manufacturing cars. Why would he want to employ or pay his employees? Well, because he knows that his employees, if they are paid well enough, can turn around and buy his product. So, this period as a whole, you're going to see an increase in wages for employees. Again, that goes back to consumer versus industrial goods. Henry Ford is going to make consumer goods. He also pioneers, he doesn't come up with it, but he perfects the assembly line. The assembly line is going to make mass productions of goods way, way quicker. Makes it way quicker, makes it a lot cheaper, all of those things. He's going to mass produce automobiles. The way that an assembly line works is you have one guy doing one task constantly, as opposed to maybe 50 people all switching tasks constantly, going ahead and maybe building several dozen cars in a day. You have 50 people, each of them doing a single task over and over and over again, and it increases production rates a ton. Ultimately, the goal here is to drive down prices and drive up profit. The rise of consumerism is going to contribute to just an overall growth of the economy during this time period. So that is Henry Ford and the assembly line. So you can see here are some of the earliest vehicles produced. You can see the assembly line over to the side of me right here. You can see them all working on cars, each of them working on one single individual part of it. And you can see the first car ever mass produced, the Model T. So, social reforms. You do have quite a bit of social reforms during this time period. They're really trying to address the issues present during the Gilded Age. The Progressive Era is very much the correction of the Gilded Age. So, first and foremost, you have muckrakers. You can hear two words in that name, muck and raker, somebody who's raking something up. These are going to be journalists who rake up the ickiness of society and they aim to show what's underneath. These are kind of expose journalists. Ultimately, some prominent names are going to include Lincoln Stephan, Ida Tarbell. Upton Sinclair is a very, very big one. Theodore Desiree, and Jacob Riis is also another very, very big one. You also have Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. These are going to be kind of the equivalent of muckrakers, but for African American issues. The other people are going to be mostly focusing on urban and industrial issues. Ida B. Wells and Du Bois are going to focus on African American civil rights. Both of them are also going to be the initial founders of the NAACP. Wells, in particular, is going to be writing about lynchings happening in the South of African American men. Roosevelt, for the most part, he's not a big fan of the muckrakers. However, they do have a very large impact on his administration because they're going to bring a lot of issues to light for the American people and cause them to push to want to see that changed. Many populists are also other populist policies are going to gain traction during the progressive era as well, such as progressive income tax, which we will talk about here shortly. Just to kind of show you how wild the regulation of the Wild West is, here are some products. Over all the way on the far side, you have Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes, cigarettes that are marketed for helping with bad breath and overall improving throat health. I love what's next to it. It's chocolate covered arsenic pills. If you know anything about arsenic, that is a very quickly it kills you type chemical. And then you got a baby in a cage, if your kid has to get some fresh air, throw them out there. And then one night cough syrup where you have cannabis and chloroform might knock you out for more than one night. Really, it's just the Wild West when it comes to regulation before the progressive era. You can say any product does anything and has anything in it. That's going to lead us to the meatpacking scandal. The meatpacking scandal is going to happen predominantly in Chicago. Here we have a picture of Teddy Roosevelt. You see he's come down from the Capitol building. He has a rake himself, and he's raking up the mud to see what's underneath. And what's underneath is going to be a meatpacking scandal. So, talking about the meatpacking scandal, in terms of the meat industry, there are absolutely no regulations. Tons of tainted meat is going out. Meat that isn't even honestly what it's marketed as. You might have it advertised as pork or as beef, and there's chunks of other meat that definitely aren't that. There, this meat is often in just massive open vats where rats and other vermin are going to be crawling above them and in them. You're going to get rat feces in it. You're going to get rat urine in it. You're also just going to have dead animals fall in it sometimes, again, like mice or rats, again, further tainting the meats. There is one horrific story of a man who fell into one of these vats. Nobody found him or his body until several days later, at which point they couldn't even identify who he was. That might sound like it was a one-off story, but there are many, many instances of they're going ahead and cutting up the meat to be ground up, and a butcher might lose a finger. That ends up in the meat. Ultimately, all of this scandal, all of this corruption is going to be brought to light by a muckraker by the name of Upton Sinclair. He's going to write The Jungle. It's a fictional story meant to bring light to the issue. Roosevelt's going to respond, which is what you saw in the previous picture. Roosevelt's response is going to show off what's going on. And Roosevelt's going to push to create the Pure Food and Drug Act to regulate the creation of food and drugs so you don't have stuff like this. This is going to create the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, which is going to be an oversight board that exists even to this day. The reason that food companies can't just lie about what's in their product is because the FDA steps in and says you can't do that. You need to be honest with what's in it. So that's the FDA. That is the Food and Drug Administration. That's part of the reforms. You also see reforms in other areas as well. You see reforms in labor. You see the creation of child labor laws, making sure that kids aren't working in unsafe conditions. You see the implementation of safety regulations. You also see overall increases in pay due to consumerism. Factory owners want to pay their employees well enough so they can go and buy their products. You see a new wave of feminism. Arguably, this is first wave feminism we're talking about here. They're still pushing for women's suffrage. They also start pushing for birth control, and Margaret Sanger is going to advocate for increased birth control. She's going to be the founder of Planned Parenthood. However, just because there's progress doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good thing. One of the progressive ideals pushed forward at the time, like people like Margaret Sanger, is eugenics. Eugenics is the practice of trying to improve human beings by selective breeding for hereditary traits. So, Margaret Sanger is going to initially set up a lot of her healthcare clinics in neighborhoods trying to provide abortions for particular groups of people. In particular, people of color and Southern and Eastern Europeans. These are the people that they don't want reproducing because they're, and I'm putting air quotes around this, inferior stock. Obviously, we know that's not true today. Eugenics, in and of itself, is a horrific science, um, and thankfully, it's frowned upon today. But there would be pushes to force sterilize people of certain races and even people who suffer from mental issues as well. Again, that's not to say everything's bad. Not everything is good. Not everything is bad. You also have the progressive amendments, which we are going to go through each of them one by one. So here you have Margaret Sanger, a bunch of ladies waiting outside a birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn. We're going to go through each of the progressive amendments. There are four of them. It's going to be 16, 17, 18, and 19. These are going to be the four progressive amendments. We have three Reconstruction amendments. We have four progressive amendments. The Reconstruction amendments we talk about in U.S. history before 1877. The 16th Amendment is progressive income tax. Basically, the more you make, the more they take. To break it down as simply as I possibly can, the more money you make, the bigger percentage of your pay cut they take. If you are making under $50,000 a year, you're probably going to get less than 5% taxes. If you're making over several $1 million a year, your tax rate's going to be much, much higher. It might be 50% plus. So the bigger pie you have, the more wealth you have, the more money you make in a year, the bigger chunk of the pie they are going to take from you. You can see that here present in this political cartoon, right? You have the working class on the treadmill. You can tell that they've been doing their part and their fair share for quite a while. You have governmental expenses, that's the treadmill, i.e., taxes, and chained around the neck of the rich man, it says income tax, and the idle rich. He's finally, quote unquote, paying his fair share. So, moving on to the next one, the 17th Amendment. So, this one has to do with how senators were originally picked under the Constitution. Under the original framing of the Constitution, the seven senators actually weren't voted for by the people. It actually didn't pop up until the 17th Amendment. Beforehand, state governments picked their senators. So you would pick the state legislator, say you live in New York, you would vote for your state congressman, you'd vote for your state governor, and then at that point, they would go ahead and they would appoint a senator. The Senate was originally meant to reflect the will of the state governments. This is going to change under the 17th Amendment because during the Gilded Age, a lot of people were bribing their way to the Senate. Basically, I go maybe approach the governor of Texas. I say, hey, I've always wanted to be senator. By the way, I'm going to give millions and millions of dollars to your governor campaign. Once he becomes governor, he's more than likely going to pick me. Essentially, men were bribing their way into the US Senate. That's going to be the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment changes it to where the senator is now picked by the popular vote of a given state. So if you're in New York, you now get to vote for your senator, not the government of New York State. Next one, 18th Amendment, very, very straightforward. No alcohol. This is the prohibition movement. Prohibition had been a long time topic here in the United States. It really comes out of the Second Great Awakening. It is also very, very tied up with domestic abuse and violence. A lot of men who are working these really crappy factory jobs are alcoholics. They go home after work, they get drunk, they're angry, they hate their lives, and unfortunately, it leads to a lot of domestic abuse. So, 18th Amendment prohibition, no manufacturing or sale of alcohol. And then finally, the 19th Amendment is really straightforward women's suffrage. So, Here's the timeline of all of it. 16th Amendment, progressive income tax. The more you make, the more they take. Next one, Senate is now picked by the people. Let me go ahead and move my face out of the way for that. They're now picked by the popular vote of the people. 18th Amendment is going to be the prohibition of manufacturing, production, and sale of alcohol in the United States. It is the only amendment in U.S. history to be repealed by another one, the 21st Amendment. You cannot just erase an amendment from the Constitution. You have to pass another one basically saying, hey, ignore that last one. And then finally, the 19th Amendment, it is going to grant the rights of women to vote in the United States. Several states had already done that, but you're going to start seeing it here in full swing, the progressive amendments. So Roosevelt and the progressive era. Roosevelt is going to advocate for a square deal. He's going to attempt to basically break up big business. He's going to label trusts. We've talked about trust in the Gilded Age lecture. He's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to bust up trusts. And he's going to label them one of two things, a good trust or a bad trust. You can see it here in this cartoon. Teddy Roosevelt has good trusts on a leash. If you can't read it, that leash says restraint. It's restraint by the US government. And bad trusts, he goes ahead and he takes out. You see more economic regulation with the 1902 coal strike, the FDA being created, and just improvements in the Chamber of Commerce. Ultimately, Roosevelt is aiming to preserve a lot of natural resources as well. Roosevelt's going to set aside land that is going to form some of the first national parks. Ultimately, he's aiming to regulate the overharvesting, in particular of timber. All of this kind of lines up pretty well with Roosevelt. He was a big outdoorsman, big fan of hunting, and you can see that present in this political cartoon, where he's hunting down bad trusts, and the good trusts are the ones who are on a leash by the US government. So, Roosevelt in Latin American policy now. It's during the progressive era as well that the US is going to start getting more involved in Latin America as well. Kind of going off of the ideas of William McKinley, um, Teddy's original president, the one who he replaces. He is going to use the Monroe Doctrine as justification. Again, going back to US history before 1877, the Monroe Doctrine is from the early 1800s. It is a doctrine put forward by James Monroe, where he's basically going to say, hey, the Western Hemisphere is under the protection and the jurisdiction of the United States. European powers are not allowed to come in here at this point moving forward and make new colonies. Keep the colonies you have, but you can't come here and be making new colonies. Again, Western Hemisphere under the protection of the United States. Roosevelt takes that idea and pushes it further, saying it's our duty to regulate, to go ahead and oversee these Latin American countries. His slogan is going to be speak softly and carry a big stick, sometimes translated as walk quietly and carry a big stick. Basically, you want to be so big, you want to be so bad, you want to be so intimidating that nobody messes with you. If the threat of force is high enough, then you're never going to have to use force. If you meet somebody who is 6'9", walking down the street, 400 pounds of pure muscle, and is carrying a crowbar, you're not going to mess with the guy. If he asks you politely, hey, where's the nearest drugstore? Where's the nearest grocery store? You're going to tell him. You're not going to be like, ah, hey, screw you. You're not going to do that because this is a big guy who can do you a lot of damage. Roosevelt does that, but with countries where the U.S. so big, so intimidating to these Latin American countries. When Roosevelt or the U.S. government goes in, they're like, okay, we'll listen to you. We'll do what you ask. The threat of force was often enough. Ultimately, under Roosevelt too, the U.S. Navy is going to grow exponentially. All of this is going to lead to the Panamanian Revolt in 1903. So, originally, the U.S. wants to go ahead and use Panama as they're going to dig a canal through it. Before 1903, the Colombian government owns Panama. The Panama Territory is not its own independent country. The US government approaches Panama, they say, hey, they approach Colombia, they say, hey, we want to dig a canal through Panama. Can we do that? Colombian government's like, no, we're not going to let you do that, US. Sorry, we're not interested. Roosevelt and the US government are like, okay, that's fine. That being said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to help the Panamanian rebels. win their independence. So there were plenty of people in Panama who no longer wanted to be a part of Colombia. The US government is going to give them a lot of guns and a lot of money to make sure that they get their independence. And when the Colombian Navy tries to go in and crack down on the revolt, they're actually going to use the US Navy to make sure they can't get through. So basically, Colombia has no choice. They have no way of quelling the Panamanian rebellion because they can't get there by land. The southern tip of Panama slash northern part of Colombia, that is very, very dangerous territory. Virtually no, the Darien Gap, nobody can go through it. So with the US naval blockade, Panama gets its independence. And with all of this, it's conditioned. The US basically makes Panama promise, hey, if we get you your independence, you let us dig the canal. You give us the land around the canal. And so Panama says, oh, we're okay with that. Here you can see a political cartoon about that, right? French intrigue. The French were the ones who were originally trying to dig the canal. All of this is going to lead to Panama, the Panamanian Republic, popping out of Colombia. You can really see over here on the map on the right-hand side that this is a massive, massive deal. It's cutting down shipping times exponentially. It goes from 21,000 kilometers to 8,000 kilometers. It makes shipping from the East Coast to the West Coast so much easier, and it makes using the US Navy so much easier. You don't just have to have two separate fleets now. Now the fleets can move across a lot easier. So this is going to lead us to our next progressive president, William Howard Taft. Taft had been handpicked by Roosevelt to succeed him. Overall, Taft is a whole lot less progressive than Roosevelt, much to the frustration of both Roosevelt and the Republicans. However, he is much harder on trusts. He's also going to use a different tactic with Latin America. He calls it dollar diplomacy, or it's called dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy basically is American businesses invest heavily in Latin America, and because of that, they have leverage on these companies. Not a whole lot to say about Taft. He was our fattest president and our last president to have facial hair. There is a story where he did get stuck in the White House bathtub. Ultimately, he is our only president to go on to become a Supreme Court justice. He becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He actually never really wanted to be president. He was originally governor of the Philippines. Roosevelt taps him to be president. He's like, okay, but I still want to be on the Supreme Court. And it's under the presidency of Warren G. Harding in the 1920s where he eventually does land on the Supreme Court as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he's our only president in American history to become a Supreme Court justice. So that is Taft. This is all going to lead us to the election of 1912. Roosevelt's very, very disappointed in Taft. Roosevelt's still very popular, so he's going to run as an independent. He starts the Bull Moose Party, also known as the Progressive Party. It ends up being between Taft, Roosevelt, who's an independent, and then Woodrow Wilson. And you have Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs is a socialist. Unfortunately, he doesn't really matter for this. Woodrow Wilson is going to run as the Democrat. Ultimately, socialism is going to spike in popularity during this period. However, they don't ever win any presidential elections. Taft and Roosevelt are basically pulling from the same base because even though Roosevelt is running as an independent, Republicans are the ones who are going to vote for him. Because of this, they split the Republican base, and neither of them end up winning, leading Woodrow Wilson to win this. And you can see it here. Electorally, they go ahead and get waffle stomped. Let me go ahead and move my face out of the way. They get waffle stomped by Wilson. Electoral votes, Wilson has 82% of the electoral vote. However, if you look at the popular vote, if you combined Taft and Roosevelt, you get over 50% of the American people wanting a Republican president. The issue is again, those two split the Republican vote, leading to Wilson walking away with it. So we are going to see our second Democrat since the election of Abraham Lincoln, which is a pretty big deal. In comes Woodrow Wilson. Now, personally, I am Woodrow Wilson's biggest off. I do not like Woodrow Wilson. I will be very honest and straightforward about it. I think he's one of our worst presidents. Woodrow Wilson is going to be president from 1913 to 1921. He's a Democrat, and he, unlike, well, Similar to both Taft and Roosevelt before him, he is very, very active in the economy. However, Taft and Roosevelt's philosophies differ from Wilson's. Taft and Roosevelt basically say we're going to go and we're going to fix the economy and let it run itself. Wilson's very different. Wilson says, I'm going to come in and have a very heavy handed approach to government. He's part of the reason that the government gets as big as it does in the 20th century. I would attribute it to him, FDR, and LBJ. These three are going to grow the size of the American federal government quite a bit during the 20th century. Ultimately, he's going to expand the federal government. He's going to create the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Trade Commission. He's going to be president during World War One. And in the last 2 years of office, he suffers from a stroke in 1919, functionally leaving him half dead. And his wife is going to be basically running the country on his behalf. That's why we have, I believe, it's the 23rd Amendment, which basically says that if the president is incapacitated, then the vice president will step up. So Woodrow Wilson's the reason that we have that whole competency clause thing in the US Constitution. He shouldn't have been running the country in those last few years, and he still tries to run again for president in the election of 1920. However, he ends up losing the Democratic bid, and ultimately Warren G. Harding, a Republican, wins the 1920 election. So that is Woodrow Wilson. And we're going to end off with this: a evolving sense of American identity. So we have this evolving sense of what it means to be an American. Progressive platforms going to offer proposals to remedy a lot of social justice issues. While the federal government does a lot, realistically, as with government even today, most of it's done on the state level. Roosevelt and others had a very, very strong sense of new nationalism as well. They wanted the immigrants coming into the United States to Americanize. And the belief about these immigrants is it's going to be easy for some of these immigrants to become Americans. It's going to be hard for others, and it might be outright impossible for a third group. Potentially impossible for certain groups, usually referring to people of color. So people of Asian, Hispanic, or Black heritage. Those that it's going to be pretty hard for, maybe impossible, that's going to be Southern and Eastern Europeans. You have increased rights being advocated for a variety of groups, including women, African Americans, Native Americans, and even Japanese Americans are starting to advocate for their rights more so now. Overall, the federal government during this time period is also going to grow massively. It's an era of immense growth. The government goes from very, very hands off with the economy in the Gilded Age. The uh, social studies term for that is laissez faire, if you want to write that out. Laissez faire, they were very, very hands off with the government or with the economy to being a lot more hands on, especially under Wilson. While all of this is going on here in the United States, though, there is trouble brewing internationally. In 1914, World War I is going to kick off, and that is where we are going to pick up on our next lecture. So, I want to go ahead and say thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, please write them down for your next class. If you're not in one of my classes, please feel free to go ahead and leave a comment on the video. I will try to go through and answer them as best as I can. Thank you for watching and have a blessed day. Ferrero out.